They called Margaret Peggy Chen too old to fly, a washed-up relic from an era when aviation was supposedly simpler and less demanding. At 58, with silver threading through her black hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, she looked nothing like the young hotshots who dominated the cockpits of Meridian Air Rescue. But when Storm Helena slammed into the Pacific Northwest with winds exceeding 120 miles per hour, trapping 6 pilots in a mountain valley with zero visibility and failing aircraft systems, Peggy became the only person standing between them and certain death. What those young pilots discovered that day would force an entire industry to question everything they thought they knew about age, experience, and what it truly means to be a pilot. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The maintenance hangar at Meridian Air Rescue felt colder than usual as Peggy wiped grease from her hands with a worn shop rag. The smell of hydraulic fluid and metal shavings filled her nostrils, familiar scents that had defined her world for the past 3 decades. Around her, the younger mechanics barely acknowledged her presence, their conversations flowing over and around her as if she were part of the equipment. She'd been relegated to routine maintenance inspections, the kind of mindless work that required her to sign off on other people's repairs. Rather than actually flying the helicopters she understood better than anyone else in the facility. Irony wasn't lost on her that she was inspecting aircraft she was no longer deemed capable of piloting. Her hands moved with practiced precision over the Bell 412's engine compartment, checking fluid levels and examining rotor blade connections with the thoroughness that came from years of knowing that shortcuts killed people. Every bolt, every wire, every hydraulic line told a story to someone who knew how to read them. Peggy had been reading these stories since before most of the current pilots had learned to drive cars. "Hey, Granny Chen, you almost done with that bird?" The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, 26 years old with barely 200 flight hours under his belt, but enough swagger to fill the entire hangar. His flight suit looked like it had been pressed that morning, creases sharp enough to cut paper, and his aviator sunglasses hung from a lanyard that screamed, "I'm a pilot," to anyone within a 50-foot radius. "We've got a training flight scheduled, and I don't want to be late because you're taking your sweet time with the pre-flight." Peggy looked up from the engine compartment, her expression neutral despite the familiar sting of the nickname. She'd been called worse things during her 28 years of military service, but somehow Granny felt more dismissive than any barracks insult ever had. "Aircraft is ready, Morrison. Just finished checking the hydraulic pressure readings. You might want to pay attention to the port engine's oil temperature today. It's running slightly warm, nothing dangerous, but worth monitoring." Jake barely glanced at the maintenance log she held out to him. "Yeah, sure, whatever. These birds are tough. They can handle a little heat." He turned to his co-pilot, a fresh-faced kid named Ryan, who looked like he'd started shaving maybe last week. "You ready to show these old-timers how real flying is done?" Ryan glanced nervously between Jake and Peggy, clearly uncomfortable with the casual disrespect, but unwilling to challenge someone who technically outranked him in the company hierarchy. Sure thing, Jake. Should we maybe review the engine temperatures that Ms. Chen mentioned?" "It's Mrs. Chen," Peggy corrected quietly, though she doubted either of them heard her. She'd been married to David for 31 years before cancer. Took him, and she still wore his ring on a chain around her neck. The title mattered to her, even if it didn't matter to them. Jake rolled his eyes dramatically. "Look, kid, these maintenance folks always find something to worry about. It's their job to be paranoid. Our job is to fly. Trust me, I've been doing this for almost 3 years now. I know what I'm doing." 3 years. Peggy had been flying helicopters since before Jake was born, had logged over 8,000 hours in everything from tiny training aircraft to massive military transport helicopters. She'd flown combat missions in Afghanistan, search and rescue operations in Alaska, and medical evacuations in conditions that would have grounded half the current pilot roster. But 3 years of civilian flying apparently trumped 3 decades of military experience in the eyes of Meridian Air Rescue's management. The transition from military to civilian aviation had been harder than she'd expected. Not the flying part. Aircraft were aircraft, and the laws of physics didn't change based on who signed your paycheck. The hard part was the culture, the assumption that military pilots were somehow less adaptable, less innovative, more rigid in their thinking. The fact that she was older than most of her colleagues' parents only made the stereotypes worse. She'd applied to Meridian Air Rescue because they claimed to value experience and maturity. Their website talked about the importance of seasoned judgment in emergency situations, the value of pilots who had seen it all and could remain calm under pressure. But the reality was different. The reality was Jake Morrison and pilots like him, young and confident and convinced that their quick reflexes and modern training made them superior to anyone over 40. The hiring interview had been a masterclass in subtle age discrimination. Nothing overt, nothing that could be documented or challenged. Just a series of questions designed to highlight her age without directly asking about it. How familiar was she with modern GPS systems? Had she used the latest generation of night vision equipment? Was she comfortable adapting to new technologies and changing procedures? Each question carried the unspoken assumption that older pilots were technologically challenged dinosaurs struggling to keep up with progress. She'd answered every question perfectly, demonstrated knowledge of systems that hadn't existed when she started flying, and scored higher on the written examinations than any candidate in the company's history. Her flight check had been flawless, her emergency procedures textbook perfect, and her references glowing. But somehow, she'd been hired as a maintenance inspector rather than a pilot, told that her extensive mechanical knowledge made her more valuable on the ground than in the air. The weekly pilot meetings were the worst part. Peggy was required to attend as part of the maintenance team, listening to flight briefings and weather updates while sitting in the back row with the other support staff. She watched as pilots half her age made basic mistakes in their mission planning, miscalculating fuel loads and ignoring weather patterns that should have been obvious to anyone with serious mountain flying experience. When she tried to offer suggestions or corrections, she was usually ignored or dismissed with patronizing smiles and comments about how things were done differently back in her day. Last month, she'd watched Jake Morrison plan a rescue mission in the Cascade Mountains without accounting for the afternoon wind patterns that regularly created severe turbulence in that particular valley. She'd tried to warn him, explaining how the topography channeled winds in ways that could turn a routine mission into a nightmare. Jake had listened with the kind of patience adults show to children explaining their imaginary friends, then proceeded with his original plan. The mission had been aborted after 20 minutes when his aircraft encountered exactly the turbulence Peggy had predicted, forcing an emergency landing and requiring a second crew to complete the rescue. The official report blamed unexpected weather conditions. Peggy's attempted warning wasn't mentioned. She'd seen this pattern repeated dozens of times over the past 18 months. Young pilots dismissing local knowledge, ignoring the kind of situational awareness that only came from years of experience, treating weather and terrain as obstacles to be conquered rather than respected. Most of the time, they got away with it. Modern aircraft were incredibly capable. Safety systems could compensate for many pilot errors, and the Pacific Northwest's weather was usually forgiving enough to allow for mistakes. But Peggy knew that most of the time wasn't good enough in aviation. It was the exceptional circumstances, the perfect storms of mechanical failure and weather and human error that killed people. And when those circumstances arose, experience mattered more than quick reflexes or modern training. It was the difference between a pilot who had seen everything before and a pilot who was seeing it for the first time. The radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. All units, we have a developing weather situation. Storm Helena is tracking north faster than predicted, with sustained winds now reaching 115 miles per hour. All non-essential flights are grounded. Effective immediately. Peggy looked out the hangar door at the darkening sky. The storm had been forecast for days, but like many weather systems in the mountains, it was proving more violent and unpredictable than the meteorologists had anticipated. She'd seen storms like this before, the kind that turned routine flights into survival situations and revealed which pilots truly understood their aircraft and which ones had just been lucky so far. Jake and Ryan were still preparing for their training flight, apparently oblivious to the changing conditions outside. The wind was already picking up, whistling through the hangar doors and rattling the metal buildings. In another hour, this place would be a war zone of flying debris and zero visibility. "Morrison," Peggy called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded flight operations in combat zones. "You need to cancel that training flight. This storm is going to be worse than predicted." Jake looked up from his pre-flight checklist with the kind of expression he might use if his grandmother had tried to explain cryptocurrency to him. "Thanks for the concern, Granny, but we're just doing some basic maneuvers in the training area. We'll be back before the weather gets serious." "The weather is already serious," Peggy said, walking over to the weather station and pointing at the barometric pressure readings. "Look at this drop rate. The storm front is moving at almost 40 knots, and the pressure gradient is indicating severe wind shear. You launch now, and you might not make it back." Ryan looked nervous, but Jake just laughed. "Peggy, I appreciate that you're worried about us, but we've got modern weather radar, GPS navigation, and autopilot systems. This isn't 1985. We don't have to fly by the seat of our pants anymore." The dismissal in his voice was so casual, so automatic, that it struck Peggy like a physical blow. 30 years of experience, thousands of hours in conditions these kids couldn't imagine, and he was treating her like an overprotective grandmother, warning them to wear their jackets. The tragedy was that Jake actually believed what he was saying. He genuinely thought that technology had eliminated the need for experience, that modern systems could substitute for judgment and situational awareness. As Jake and Ryan walked toward their aircraft, Peggy felt the familiar weight of being invisible, of having knowledge that no one wanted to hear. She'd tried to warn them, had done everything she could short of physically blocking their path to the helicopter. But she was just the maintenance inspector, the old lady who checked oil levels and worried too much about weather reports. The radio chattered with updates from other aircraft in the region, reports of increasing turbulence and deteriorating visibility. Storm Helena was proving to be more dangerous than anyone had anticipated, and there were already several aircraft requesting emergency assistance. But Jake's helicopter lifted off from the tarmac, disappearing into the gray murk of the approaching storm. Peggy watched them go with the sick certainty that she would see them again before the day was over. But not under circumstances anyone would want. 18 months earlier, Peggy had been Meridian Air Rescue's most senior pilot, the one they called when conditions were too dangerous for anyone else. She'd earned that reputation through decades of flying in situations where others wouldn't dare, where experience and judgment mattered more than technology or youth. But reputation, she learned, could be destroyed in a single moment of bureaucratic cowardice. The call had come in at 2:47 a.m. on a February morning, when the temperature was dropping towards zero and fog was rolling through the mountain valleys like a living thing. 3 climbers were stranded on Mount Jefferson, hypothermic and injured after an avalanche had swept away their camp. The weather was marginal at best, with cloud ceilings dropping rapidly and wind gusts approaching the limits of safe helicopter operation. Standard protocol called for waiting until daylight and improved conditions before attempting any rescue. Peggy had been on duty that night, officially the pilot in command for emergency responses. She'd studied the weather reports, calculated fuel loads and performance parameters, and run through every possible scenario in her mind. The climbers had maybe 6 hours before hypothermia killed them. The weather window was closing fast, but there was still a narrow opportunity to get in and out safely if everything went perfectly. Chief Pilot Robert Hendricks had been adamant about waiting. Hendricks was 42 years old, competent enough in routine situations, but the kind of pilot who followed regulations like religious doctrine. He'd been promoted to chief pilot not because of his flying ability, but because he was good at managing budgets and avoiding liability. Safety, to Hendricks, meant never taking risks, never pushing boundaries, never putting the company in a position where lawyers might ask uncomfortable questions. Absolutely not, Hendricks had said when Peggy proposed the rescue mission. Weather conditions are below minimums. We wait until morning. He'd been sitting in the operations center, surrounded by weather charts and company policy manuals, speaking with the certainty of someone who'd never had to look a dying person in the eye and explain why regulations were more important than their life. Peggy had tried to explain the tactical situation. The climbers were at 8,000 feet, above the cloud layer that was causing most of the visibility problems. The wind, while strong, was steady rather than gusty, which made it manageable for an experienced pilot. The helicopter's performance at that altitude and temperature was well within acceptable parameters. Most importantly, she'd flown similar missions dozens of times during her military career, in conditions that made this look like a training exercise. Mrs. Chen, Hendricks, had said, using her title like a weapon, "I understand that you have extensive military experience, but civilian operations have different standards, different risk tolerances. We can't justify exposing our crew and aircraft to those conditions based on your personal assessment of the situation." The pause before personal assessment had been loaded with meaning. It wasn't her professional judgment as a pilot with 8,000 flight hours and 3 decades of experience. It was her personal opinion, the kind of emotional response you might expect from someone whose age was affecting their decision-making abilities. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the flight surgeon who monitored all rescue operations, had supported Peggy's assessment. The medical data was clear. Hypothermia would kill the climbers within hours. A rescue attempt, even a risky one, was their only chance of survival. But medical recommendations carried less weight than legal liability in Hendricks' calculations. Peggy had made her decision in that moment, the kind of split-second judgment call that defined a pilot's career. She could follow orders, wait until morning, and help recover 3 bodies. Or she could trust 30 years of experience and launch a mission that might save 3 lives. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She'd walked out to the aircraft without another word, running through her pre-flight inspection with the mechanical precision that came from muscle memory. The Bell 429 was in perfect condition, fuel tanks topped off, all systems green. Her crew had consisted of Dave Patterson, a paramedic with 15 years of mountain rescue experience, and Lisa Chang, a flight nurse who'd volunteered for the mission despite knowing it violated company policy. The launch had been smooth, the helicopter lifting off into the pre-dawn darkness with the steady confidence of a machine operated by someone who understood its capabilities intimately. Peggy had flown the route dozens of times, knew every ridge and valley, every radio tower and power line that could turn a routine flight into a disaster. The weather was challenging but manageable, requiring constant attention and precise control inputs. Finding the climbers had taken 47 minutes of careful searching, using night vision equipment and thermal imaging to locate their heat signatures against the snow-covered mountainside. The landing had been the most difficult part, setting down on a narrow ledge barely wider than the helicopter's skids while maintaining power and rotor RPM in case a quick departure became necessary. Dave and Lisa had worked with practiced efficiency, stabilizing the climbers and preparing them for transport. 2 of the 3 were conscious but severely hypothermic, their core body temperatures dangerously low. The 3rd was unconscious, showing signs of advanced hypothermia that would be fatal without immediate medical intervention. Every minute counted, and everyone on the crew knew it. The flight back had been a masterclass in mountain flying, navigating through deteriorating weather conditions while maintaining the smooth, stable flight profile necessary for medical care. Peggy had threaded the helicopter through gaps in the clouds, using her knowledge of local weather patterns to find pockets of clear air. When the instruments showed nothing but solid overcast, all 3 climbers had survived. 2 had made full recoveries after treatment for hypothermia and minor injuries. The 3rd had required emergency surgery but was back to climbing within 6 months. The rescue had been featured in local newspapers as an example of heroic aviation, with photos of Peggy and her crew receiving commendations from the State Emergency Management Agency. But heroism, Peggy discovered, was less important than procedure when corporate lawyers got involved. Federal Aviation Administration had launched an investigation within a week, not because of any safety violations or mechanical problems, but because a competitor had filed a complaint alleging that Meridian Air Rescue was conducting unsafe operations. The investigation had found that the rescue mission violated company weather minimums and had been launched without proper authorization from the chief pilot. Hendricks had thrown Peggy under the bus with a thoroughness that impressed even the lawyers. According to his official statement, he had explicitly ordered her to stand down, and she had willfully disobeyed a direct order from her superior. He characterized her decision-making as reckless and age-inappropriate, suggesting that older pilots might be more prone to taking unnecessary risks due to overconfidence in outdated flying techniques. The company's insurance carrier had been even more direct. Peggy's age made her a liability risk, they claimed. Statistics showed that pilots over 55 had different risk assessment patterns than younger pilots, and her unauthorized rescue mission was evidence of age-related impairment in judgment. They recommended immediate removal from flight duties, pending a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation. The hearing had been a foregone conclusion. Peggy had sat in a conference room surrounded by lawyers, insurance executives, and company administrators listening as they systematically dismantled her reputation and career. Her 3 decades of military service were dismissed as different operational environments with different risk tolerances. Her perfect safety record was characterized as luck rather than skill. Her decision to save 3 lives was presented as evidence of deteriorating judgment and inability to follow orders. The most damaging testimony had come from Dr. Rebecca Walsh, an aviation psychologist hired by the insurance company to evaluate Peggy's fitness for duty. Dr. Walsh had never met Peggy before the hearing, had never observed her flying, and had no experience with mountain rescue operations. But she had extensive experience testifying in liability cases, and her conclusions were devastating. Mrs. Chen exhibits classic symptoms of age-related overconfidence, Dr. Walsh had testified. Older pilots often believe their experience makes them immune to the normal rules of safe operation. They tend to take risks that younger, more cautious pilots would appropriately avoid. This rescue mission demonstrates exactly the kind of poor judgment we expect to see in pilots approaching the end of their careers. Peggy's military records, which documented hundreds of successful missions in far more dangerous conditions, were ruled inadmissible as not relevant to civilian operations. The testimony of the climber she'd saved was dismissed as emotionally biased. Even the commendations from State Emergency Management were characterized as political gestures rather than professional recognition. The final blow had come from Hendricks himself, who testified that Peggy had become increasingly difficult to manage in recent months, showing resistance to new procedures and unwillingness to accept guidance from supervisory personnel. He painted a picture of an aging pilot who resented younger colleagues and refused to acknowledge that her skills were deteriorating. None of it was true, but truth was less important than liability protection. The hearing board's decision was unanimous. Peggy would be removed from flight duties permanently, transferred to a maintenance position where her extensive mechanical knowledge could be utilized without endangering lives or exposing the company to legal risk. The irony was that the climber she'd saved had tried to testify on her behalf, describing how her skill and judgment had saved their lives when following procedures would have killed them. But their testimony was ruled irrelevant to the question of whether she'd violated company policy. The fact that she'd made the right decision, that people were alive because of her experience and courage, meant nothing in the face of bureaucratic liability management. 6 months later, Jake Morrison had been hired as a pilot despite having less flight experience than most helicopter mechanics. His youth and enthusiasm were seen as assets, evidence of fresh thinking and adaptability to modern aviation practices. During his interview, he'd confidently explained how new technology made experience less important, how GPS navigation and advanced weather radar eliminated the need for old-school flying techniques. Watching Jake and the other young pilots operate had been like watching history repeat itself in reverse. They flew with the confidence that came from never having been truly tested, never having faced conditions where technology failed and only experience and judgment mattered. They dismissed weather warnings because their radar didn't show immediate danger. They ignored local knowledge because their GPS systems provided more precise navigation. They treated aircraft limitations as suggestions rather than absolute boundaries because their training had never shown them the consequences of being wrong. Peggy had tried to share her knowledge, offering insights gained from decades of mountain flying and combat operations, but her input was politely ignored or openly dismissed. She was the maintenance inspector, the grounded pilot whose career had ended in disgrace. Her warnings about weather patterns and aircraft limitations were seen as the complaints of someone who couldn't adapt to modern aviation. The bitter truth was that her punishment had nothing to do with the quality of her flying or the soundness of her judgment. It was about age, about insurance liability, about a corporate culture that valued compliance over competence. She'd been sacrificed to protect the company from lawsuits, her reputation destroyed to maintain the fiction that following procedures was more important than saving lives. Now, as Storm Helena gathered strength outside the hangar, Peggy watched Jake Morrison's helicopter disappear into the gray murk and felt the familiar weight of knowledge that no one wanted to hear. She'd tried to warn them, had done everything she could within the limits of her position. But she was just the maintenance inspector now, the old lady who worried too much and understood too little about modern aviation. The radio continued its stream of weather updates and emergency traffic, painting a picture of rapidly deteriorating conditions throughout the region. Other aircraft were already reporting severe turbulence and requesting assistance. Storm Helena was proving to be everything Peggy had predicted and worse. But Jake Morrison was young and confident and equipped with modern technology. Surely that would be enough. The storm hit harder and faster than anyone except Peggy had anticipated. Within 30 minutes of Jake's departure, wind speeds had increased to 130 miles per hour, and visibility had dropped to less than a quarter mile. The operations center at Meridian Air Rescue had transformed from its usual quiet efficiency into a chaos of ringing phones, crackling radios, and increasingly frantic weather updates. Peggy remained in the maintenance hangar, officially off duty, but unable to leave while aircraft were still airborne in deteriorating conditions. She'd positioned herself near the radio equipment, monitoring emergency frequencies and tracking the locations of various aircraft through the facility's radar system. Her fingers moved across the controls with the familiarity of someone who'd spent countless hours coordinating flight operations, noting wind directions, pressure readings, and the subtle changes in radio transmissions that indicated pilots were fighting conditions beyond their experience. The first emergency call came from a private pilot flying a Cessna 172 near Mount Hood. The single-engine aircraft had been caught by surprise when the storm accelerated its approach, and the pilot was reporting severe turbulence and disorientation. His voice over the radio carried the tight control of someone trying not to panic, but Peggy could hear the stress underneath. "Mayday, mayday, this is Cessna 478 Charlie Delta. I'm caught in severe turbulence approximately 15 miles northwest of Mount Hood. My GPS is showing erratic readings, and I'm having difficulty maintaining altitude. Requesting immediate assistance." The response came from Meridian's operations center, where Chief Pilot Hendricks was coordinating rescue efforts. "Cessna 8 Charlie Delta. This is Meridian Operations. We're tracking your position, but all our aircraft are currently grounded due to weather conditions. Can you maintain current altitude and heading until conditions improve?" Peggy shook her head as she listened to the exchange. The Cessna pilot was flying in a valley known for severe downdrafts during storm conditions, and his GPS problems were likely caused by the mountainous terrain interfering with satellite signals. Maintaining altitude in those conditions would be nearly impossible for someone without extensive mountain flying experience, and until conditions improve could mean hours that the pilot didn't have. She keyed her radio to the emergency frequency, her voice calm and professional. "Cessna 8 Charlie Delta, this is Meridian Maintenance. Are you familiar with the Timberline emergency strip approximately 8 miles southeast of your current position?" "Negative, Meridian Maintenance. I'm not familiar with the area." This was supposed to be a routine cross-country flight. "Copy that. The strip is a private field with a 3,200-foot paved runway, no obstructions. I can provide vectors if you're interested in attempting an approach." There was a pause before Hendrick's voice cut into the frequency, sharp with authority. "Meridian Maintenance, this is Operations. You are not authorized to provide navigation assistance. Cease all radio transmissions immediately." Peggy felt her jaw tighten. The Cessna pilot was in immediate danger, and she was the only person in the facility who knew the location of every emergency landing strip within a 100-mile radius. But protocol demanded that only certified flight coordinators could provide navigation assistance, even when lives were at stake. "Meridian Operations, the pilot needs help now," she transmitted. "I have extensive knowledge of emergency landing sites in this region. Maintenance, you will clear this frequency immediately." "That is a direct order." The radio fell silent, except for the Cessna pilot's increasingly desperate position reports. Peggy listened as his altitude continued to drop, his fuel reserves dwindled, and his options disappeared one by one. 20 minutes later, emergency services were dispatched to a crash site 8 miles from the Timberline strip she'd tried to direct him to. The pilot survived with serious injuries, but the aircraft was destroyed. The second emergency came from a medical helicopter attempting to transport a heart attack patient from a rural hospital to Portland. The crew was experienced, but they'd been caught by the storm's unexpected intensity and were reporting severe icing conditions that were affecting their aircraft's performance. "Lifeguard 6 were accumulating ice faster than our de-icing systems can handle," the pilot reported. "We're going to need to set down somewhere and wait this out." Peggy knew the helicopter's route and the terrain they were flying over. There were limited options for emergency landings in that area, and most of them would be impossible to find in current visibility conditions. But there was one possibility, a small airport with precision approach lighting that could guide them down. Even in near-zero visibility, she started to reach for the radio, then stopped herself. Hendricks had made it clear that she was not to provide any assistance to aircraft in distress. Her maintenance position didn't include flight coordination responsibilities, and any unauthorized radio transmissions could result in immediate termination. But listening to the medical helicopter situation deteriorate, knowing she could help while being forbidden to act, felt like a special kind of torture. The lifeguard helicopter eventually found a place to land at a small municipal airport, but not before losing 20 critical minutes searching for a suitable site. The heart attack patient survived, but the delay had complicated his treatment and prolonged his recovery. By 3 p.m., Storm Helena had grounded every aircraft in the region except for those already caught in the air when the weather hit. The operations center was coordinating with multiple emergency services, tracking 6 different aircraft that were either missing, overdue, or reporting various levels of distress. It was exactly the kind of situation that separated experienced pilots from those who'd simply been lucky so far. Jake Morrison's voice finally crackled through the radio, and Peggy could hear the strain despite his attempt to sound casual. Meridian Operations. This is Rescue 7. We're having some difficulty with our navigation system. GPS seems to be acting up, and visibility is pretty much zero out here. Hendricks responded immediately. Rescue 7, what's your current position and fuel state? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure of our position. The GPS has been giving conflicting readings for the past 20 minutes. Fuel is at about 40%, maybe a little less. Peggy felt her stomach tighten. 40% fuel in a Bell 412 meant roughly 90 minutes of flight time under normal conditions. But fighting severe weather and potentially flying in circles while lost could cut that time dramatically. She pulled up the radar display and studied the weather patterns, trying to determine where Jake might have gone wrong. The training area where Jake had planned to fly was directly in the path of the storm's worst winds. If he'd continued with his original flight plan despite the weather warnings, he would have encountered severe turbulence and wind shear that could have pushed his aircraft significantly off course. Add GPS problems caused by the storm's electromagnetic interference, and it was entirely possible that he had no idea where he was. Jake, can you describe any landmarks or terrain features you can see? Hendricks asked. Negative on landmarks. We're completely socked in. I can barely see my own rotor disc. All I've got is mountains below us, but that doesn't narrow it down much around here. Mountains below them. Peggy studied the topographic charts, cross-referencing the likely drift patterns with Jake's original flight plan. If the wind had pushed him north and east of his intended route, he could be anywhere in a 100-square-mile area of wilderness, most of it above 6,000 feet elevation with limited emergency landing options. Ryan's voice came through the radio next, and Peggy could hear the fear he was trying to hide. Meridian Operations were also getting some unusual engine readings. Oil temperature on the port engine is climbing, and we're seeing fluctuations in hydraulic pressure. The port engine running hot. Peggy closed her eyes, remembering her conversation with Jake before takeoff. She'd specifically warned him about monitoring the port engine's oil temperature, but he'd dismissed her concerns with typical confidence. Now, fighting severe weather conditions and running at high power settings while lost, that marginally high oil temperature had become a serious problem. Rescue 7, what are your current oil temperature and hydraulic pressure readings? Hendricks asked. Jake read off a series of numbers that made Peggy wince. The oil temperature was approaching the red line, and hydraulic pressure was fluctuating between normal and dangerously low. In a twin-engine helicopter, losing one engine was manageable under ideal conditions. But in severe weather, at high altitude, with marginal visibility and an inexperienced crew, a single engine failure could quickly become catastrophic. Operations, we need to get this bird on the ground soon. Jake's voice was losing its casual confidence. These engine readings are making me nervous. Copy that, Rescue 7. We're working on vectors to the nearest suitable landing site. Peggy looked at the weather radar and shook her head. The nearest suitable landing site was the same airport where the medical helicopter had eventually found shelter, but that was over 50 miles from Jake's probable position. With deteriorating weather, mechanical problems, and fuel concerns, there was no way they'd make it that far, but there were other options. Emergency landing sites that didn't appear on standard aviation charts. During her military service, Peggy had memorized the location of every possible landing area in the region, including logging roads, clear-cuts, and abandoned airstrips that could accommodate a helicopter in an emergency. She knew the terrain intimately, understood the wind patterns, and weather phenomena that could trap aircraft in valleys with no escape routes. She also knew that Jake and Ryan were flying in the most dangerous area of the entire region, a maze of steep valleys and knife-edge ridges where downdrafts could slam an aircraft into the ground without warning. The weather conditions were creating a perfect storm of wind shear, turbulence, and rapidly changing visibility that could challenge even the most experienced pilot. The radio continued its stream of position, reports and weather updates, but Peggy could hear the growing desperation in Jake's transmissions. His aircraft was slowly being destroyed by the storm. His fuel was running low, and his inexperience was becoming more apparent with each radio call. He was making basic mistakes, fighting the weather instead of working with it, burning fuel, and stressing his aircraft in ways that would ultimately prove fatal. Ryan's voice came through again, higher-pitched and clearly frightened. Operations, we just lost hydraulic pressure completely. Flight controls are getting really heavy, and the aircraft is not responding normally. Complete hydraulic failure. Peggy felt her blood run cold. In a Bell 412, hydraulic systems powered the flight controls, making the aircraft manageable for normal-sized pilots. Without hydraulics, controlling the helicopter required enormous physical strength and precise technique, especially in turbulent conditions. It was the kind of emergency that separated truly skilled pilots from those who'd simply never been tested. Rescue 7, you need to land immediately, Hendricks transmitted. Any flat area you can find, even if it's not ideal. Operations, we can't see anything below us except trees and rocks. There's nowhere to land. But Peggy knew better. She knew exactly where they were now, could picture the terrain based on Jake's description, and the radar returns showing their approximate position. There was a logging road approximately 2 miles northeast of their current location, wide enough for a helicopter and recently cleared of obstructions. It wasn't ideal, but it was survivable. She reached for the radio microphone, then stopped. Hendricks had made it clear that any unauthorized transmissions would result in immediate termination. But Jake and Ryan were about to die, and she was the only person who could save them. The choice was simple, even if the consequences weren't. Peggy's hand closed around the radio microphone with the same decisive grip she'd used 30 years ago, when making split-second decisions over hostile territory. The weight of the device felt familiar, substantial, like every other moment in her career, when she'd been forced to choose between following orders and doing what was right. She could hear Jake's breathing over the radio, rapid and shallow. The sound of someone fighting panic while his aircraft slowly disintegrated around him. Rescue 7, this is Meridian Maintenance, she transmitted, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd talked pilots through emergencies when failure meant death. I'm going to guide you to an emergency landing site. Do you have me? Clearly? The response came instantly from Hendricks, his voice sharp with anger. Maintenance, clear this frequency immediately. You are not authorized to provide flight assistance. Peggy ignored him completely, her attention focused entirely on the 2 young men whose lives hung in the balance. Jake, I need you to turn to heading 045 degrees and begin a slow descent to 4,500 feet. There's a logging road approximately 2 miles from your current position that's wide enough for an emergency landing. Thank God, Ryan's voice crackled through the static. Which way is 045? The question revealed just how disoriented they'd become. Jake, despite his confidence and modern training, had lost basic situational awareness in the storm. without GPS. And with limited visibility, he was essentially flying blind, relying on instruments he didn't fully trust and instincts he'd never properly developed. "Jake, your compass should show northeast," Peggy continued. "Turn right until your heading indicator reads 045. Ryan, I need you to help monitor the turn. In these conditions, spatial disorientation can happen fast." "Maintenance, you will cease all transmissions immediately," Hendricks cut in. "Operations is handling this situation." But Operations wasn't handling the situation. Operations was coordinating with distant emergency services and consulting weather charts, while two pilots fought for their lives in real time. Peggy had been in Jake's position before, had felt the sickening disorientation of flying in zero visibility with failing aircraft systems. She knew that theoretical knowledge and proper procedures meant nothing when your helicopter was shaking apart and you had minutes to find somewhere safe to land. "I see the heading," Jake reported, his voice steadier now that someone was providing concrete guidance. Turning to 045, "How far did you say this landing site was?" 2 miles. "You'll need to descend slowly because the terrain rises toward the logging road. Keep your descent rate under 300 feet per minute and be ready for downdrafts. As you get closer to the ridge." Peggy pulled up the sectional chart on her tablet, tracing the route with her finger while calculating fuel consumption and flight time. The logging road was their best option, but it wasn't without risks. The approach would require threading between two mountain peaks in near-zero visibility, and the road itself was narrow with trees on both sides. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the helicopter would become a fireball. "Maintenance, this is your final warning." Hendricks' voice was ice-cold with fury. "Cease all radio transmissions or face immediate termination." "Copy that, Operations," Peggy replied, then immediately keyed the microphone again. "Rescue 7. You should be approaching the ridge now. The logging road runs east-west along the ridgeline. When you break through the cloud layer, you'll see it cutting through the trees." She was risking everything now, her job, her pension, any chance of ever working in aviation again. But she'd made this choice before, and the consequences had been worth it then. 3 climbers had lived because she'd ignored orders and trusted her judgment. Now Jake and Ryan would live for the same reason, assuming she could guide them safely through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain pilots. "I think I can see something," Jake reported. "There's a break in the trees, looks like a road. Pretty narrow, though." "That's it. The road is approximately 60 feet wide, more than enough for your rotor disc. Set up for a normal approach, but be ready for wind shear as you descend below the ridgeline." The next few minutes were the longest of Peggy's career. She listened to Jake's approach calls, visualizing every stage of the descent from her knowledge of the terrain and weather patterns. The wind would be gusting and unpredictable near the ridge, creating pockets of severe turbulence that could slam the helicopter into the ground if Jake wasn't prepared for them. "Getting heavy turbulence," Jake reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Controls are really sluggish without hydraulics." "Stay on the controls, don't fight the turbulence," Peggy transmitted. "Let the aircraft ride through the rough air, make small corrections only. Ryan, call out altitude and airspeed." 500 feet above the road, 60 knots, Ryan responded immediately. He was learning fast, rising to the challenge despite his fear. "Good. Slow to 40 knots and continue descent. The wind will try to push you east of the road, so maintain a slight left drift correction." Peggy could hear the strain in the engine noise over the radio, the sound of machinery operating at its limits. The port engine's oil temperature was probably climbing toward dangerous levels, and the complete hydraulic failure meant that Jake was fighting enormous control forces with every input. It was exactly the kind of emergency that killed inexperienced pilots, but Jake was following her instructions with precision that surprised her. 50 feet, "35 knots, Ryan called out. "Perfect. Start your flare now, easy on the collective. Let the aircraft settle onto the road." The radio went silent for several seconds that felt like hours. Then Jake's voice came through, shaky but triumphant. "We're down. We're actually down and in one piece." Relief flooded through Peggy like a physical wave, but her celebration was cut short by Hendricks' voice over the facility intercom. "Margaret Chen, report to my office immediately." Before she could respond, the radio erupted with new emergency traffic. Another helicopter, this one carrying a flight instructor and 3 student pilots, was reporting similar problems. They'd been caught by the storm during a training flight, and were now lost, low on fuel, and dealing with engine problems that were getting worse by the minute. "Mayday, mayday, this is helicopter training flight 205. We are lost. Approximately 20 miles west of Mount Hood, with less than 30 minutes of fuel remaining. We have 1 engine running rough and are requesting immediate assistance." Peggy looked toward Hendricks' office, where the chief pilot was undoubtedly preparing to fire her for insubordination. Then she looked at the radio, where 4 more lives hung in the balance. The choice was even simpler than before. "Training Flight 205, this is Meridian Maintenance. I copy your mayday and am prepared to provide navigation assistance." "Maintenance, cease all transmissions immediately," came Hendricks' voice over the radio. "You are relieved of duty effective immediately." But emergency radio protocols superseded company authority, and Peggy knew it. Once an aircraft declared a mayday, anyone with the ability to assist was not only authorized, but legally obligated to provide help. Hendricks could fire her later, but he couldn't stop her from saving lives. Right now. "Training Flight 205, what are your current engine readings and fuel quantity?" The instructor pilot responded with readings that made Peggy's blood run cold. They were in worse shape than Jake and Ryan had been, flying on fumes with an engine that was minutes away from catastrophic failure. Worse, they were carrying student pilots who had minimal experience with emergency procedures. "We've got maybe 20 minutes of fuel, probably less," the instructor reported. "The rough engine is losing power, and I'm not sure how much longer. It's going to keep running, 20 minutes. Peggy studied the charts frantically, looking for any emergency landing site within range of their position. There were a few possibilities, but all of them required precise navigation in weather conditions that made accurate positioning nearly impossible. "Flight 205, I'm going to vector you toward Cascade Meadows. It's a private strip about 15 miles northeast of your position. The runway is 2,800 feet, paved with approach lighting." "We don't have 15 miles worth of fuel," the instructor replied. Stress evident in his voice. Peggy recalculated quickly, considering fuel consumption rates and the helicopter's degraded performance with 1 engine running rough. The instructor was right. They wouldn't make it to Cascade Meadows. But there was another option, one that would require perfect execution in terrible conditions. "Alternative plan," she transmitted. "There's a highway rest stop approximately 8 miles south of your position. Interstate 84, eastbound side. The parking area is large enough for an emergency landing if you can find it." Finding a highway rest stop in near-zero visibility was like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach, but it was their only chance. Peggy began providing vectors based on known radio navigation aids, using techniques she'd learned during military service when GPS systems failed and pilots had to rely on fundamental navigation skills. "Turn to heading 180 degrees and begin descent to 3,000 feet, she instructed. "You'll intersect the highway at approximately 5 miles. When you see it, follow the road east until you see the rest stop buildings." As she guided the training flight toward safety, Peggy became aware of other voices on the radio frequency. 2 private aircraft were reporting emergencies, both trapped by the storm and running out of options. A search and rescue helicopter from the Coast Guard was requesting assistance with navigation to a maritime emergency. A medical transport was trying to find an alternate route to Portland with a critical patient. Storm Helena had created a perfect storm of aviation emergencies, and Peggy found herself at the center of it all. Every few minutes brought new mayday calls, new aircraft in distress, new pilots whose lives depended on someone with the knowledge and experience to guide them to safety. Hendricks appeared in the hangar doorway, his face red with anger. "Chen, you're fired. Security will escort you from the premises immediately." Peggy looked at him calmly, then keyed the radio again. "Training Flight 205. You should be approaching the highway now. Look for a concrete ribbon running east-west through the valley." "I see it," the instructor called out. "Following the highway east now. Security is on their way," Hendricks warned. "You can finish this from the parking lot." But Peggy wasn't going anywhere. She'd found her purpose again, the reason she'd become a pilot in the first place. It wasn't about following orders or protecting corporate liability. It was about using her skills and knowledge to save lives when others couldn't or wouldn't. The young pilots who dismissed her as too old and out of touch were learning that experience mattered, that technology couldn't replace judgment, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimated was exactly who you needed when everything went wrong. The radio crackled with another emergency call, and Peggy reached for the microphone again. She had work to do. Security never came. As Storm Helena continued its rampage across the Pacific Northwest, Hendricks discovered that firing the only person capable of coordinating multiple emergency rescues was a luxury he couldn't afford. The radio traffic had become a constant stream of mayday calls, and Peggy had positioned herself as the unofficial air traffic controller for what was rapidly becoming the worst aviation emergency in the region's history. Training Flight 205 had successfully landed at the highway rest stop, their engine failing completely just as the skids touched pavement. The instructor pilot's voice over the radio was shaky with relief and something approaching awe. "Meridian Maintenance, this is Flight 205. We're safely on the ground thanks to your guidance. I don't know how you threaded us through that weather, but you saved 4 lives today." Before Peggy could respond, another emergency call cut through the frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Life Flight 12. We're a medical helicopter with a critical patient, currently lost in zero visibility conditions somewhere over the Cascade foothills. Our GPS is malfunctioning. We're low on fuel, and the patient is deteriorating rapidly." Peggy felt her pulse quicken. Medical helicopters carried specialized equipment that made forced landings extremely dangerous, and they operated under time pressures that commercial aircraft never faced. Every minute the patient spent in the air was potentially a minute closer to death, but landing in unsuitable terrain could kill everyone aboard. "Life Flight 12, this is Meridian Maintenance. What's your approximate position and fuel remaining?" "We departed Salem 40 minutes ago, heading northeast toward Portland. Current fuel shows about 20 minutes remaining, maybe less. The weather hit us harder than forecast, and we've been fighting headwinds and turbulence for the past 30 minutes. 20 minutes of fuel on a 40-minute flight meant they were already running on fumes." Peggy pulled up her mental map of the area between Salem and Portland, considering terrain, weather patterns, and available landing sites. The most direct route would take them over heavily forested hills with limited emergency options, but there were alternatives if she could guide them correctly. "Life Flight 12, I'm going to vector you toward Aurora State Airport. It's about 12 miles northeast of your current position, and they have an instrument approach that can get you down in this weather." The pilot's response carried barely controlled desperation. "Negative, we don't have 12 miles worth of fuel. We need something closer." Peggy closed her eyes, visualizing the terrain and calculating distances. There was one possibility, but it would require precision flying. in conditions that challenged even experienced pilots. The Willamette Valley had several small private airstrips, and one of them was almost perfectly positioned for the medical helicopter's current location. Alternative option, she transmitted. Sportsman's Air Park, approximately 6 miles due north of your position. Single runway, 2,200 feet, but it has pilot-controlled lighting that you can activate on frequency 122.8. How do we find a 2,200-foot runway in zero visibility? Trust me, I'll talk you down. First, turn to heading 360 degrees and begin descent to 1,500 feet. The strip runs east-west through a valley between two small hills. When you get within 2 miles, activate the runway lighting and it should become visible. As she guided the medical helicopter toward safety, Peggy became aware of voices behind her. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the flight surgeon who'd supported her during the Mount Jefferson rescue, had arrived in the hangar along with several other emergency personnel. They were listening to her radio work with expressions of growing amazement. "Life Flight 12, you should be approaching the valley now," Peggy continued. "Activate your landing lights and look for the runway lighting system. It will appear as 2 parallel lines of white lights cutting through the darkness." "I see them," the pilot called out. "Sweet mother of pearl, I actually see the runway. Beginning approach now." Dr. Martinez stepped closer to Peggy's position. "How do you know the exact location of every landing strip in a 100-mile radius?" she asked quietly. 30 years of flying in conditions like this," Peggy replied without taking her eyes off the radio equipment. "When technology fails, local knowledge is all you have left." The medical helicopter landed safely at Sportsman's Air Park with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. The patient was transferred to a ground ambulance and survived, though the delay caused by the weather had been critical. As Life Flight 12 shut down their engines, yet another emergency call came through the radio dot. This one was different. The voice was older, more experienced, carrying the calm professionalism of someone who'd been flying longer than most of the other pilots had been alive. Any station. This is Coast Guard Rescue 6203. We are a twin-engine aircraft with 8 souls on board, currently executing a search and rescue mission for a missing fishing vessel. We have encountered severe icing conditions and are requesting immediate assistance. Coast Guard." Peggy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Coast Guard pilots were among the most experienced and capable in the world, flying in conditions that would ground most civilian aircraft. If they were calling for help, the situation was truly desperate. "Coast Guard 6203, this is Meridian Maintenance. I copy your emergency. What's your current position and aircraft status?" "We're approximately 30 miles west of Newport, flying at 4,000 feet. Ice accumulation is severe and affecting our flight characteristics. We've lost approximately 20% of our airspeed capability, and the situation is deteriorating rapidly." Severe icing was one of aviation's deadliest hazards, capable of bringing down even the largest aircraft if conditions were right. Ice accumulated on wing surfaces and propeller blades, disrupting airflow and adding enormous weight. Modern aircraft had de-icing systems, but they had limitations, and the Coast Guard helicopter was clearly approaching those limits. 6203, what are your de-icing system status and fuel remaining? De-icing systems are operating but unable to keep up with ice. Accumulation rate. Fuel is adequate for now, but our reduced airspeed is affecting consumption calculations. We need to find warmer air or a place to land immediately. Peggy studied weather charts on her tablet, looking for temperature gradients and altitude bands where the icing conditions might be less severe. The Coast Guard helicopter was trapped in a layer of freezing rain and supercooled water droplets, but meteorological data suggested that warmer air existed both above and below their current altitude. 6,203. I recommend immediate descent to 2,000 feet. Surface temperatures in your area are showing above freezing, and you should encounter warmer air below 2,500 feet. Negative. Terrain in this area requires minimum altitude of 3,500 feet for safe clearance. Of course, the coastal mountains rose to over 3,000 feet in that area, and descending to warmer air would put the helicopter dangerously close to terrain in zero visibility conditions. But Peggy knew something that the Coast Guard pilot might not. There was a valley that extended inland from the coast, providing a corridor where aircraft could descend safely while remaining clear of mountain peaks. 6,203. There's a river valley approximately 5 miles east of your position that will allow safe descent to 2,000 feet. Turn to heading 090 degrees and follow the Silets River inland. The valley floor is at 400 feet elevation, so you'll have plenty of terrain clearance. The Coast Guard pilot was quiet for a moment, probably consulting charts and considering his options. Meridian maintenance, we show that valley on our charts. Turning to 090 degrees and beginning descent. As she guided the Coast Guard helicopter toward warmer air and safety, Peggy noticed that the hangar had filled with people. Mechanics, pilots, emergency personnel, and administrative staff had gathered around her radio position, listening to her coordinate rescue after rescue with growing amazement. Even Hendrik stood in the background, his earlier anger replaced by something approaching stunned disbelief. 6,203. You should be entering the valley now, Peggy transmitted. Continue descent to 2,000 feet and maintain heading until you're clear of icing conditions. Roger. Descending to 2,000 feet. And Meridian maintenance, whoever you are, you just saved 8 lives and a very expensive helicopter. Ice is already beginning to shed, and our airspeed is returning to normal. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her voice carrying authority that cut through the background noise. Peggy, I've been monitoring the emergency frequencies for the past 2 hours. You've successfully guided 7 aircraft to safety in conditions that have grounded every other rescue operation in the region. How is that possible? Before Peggy could answer, her radio crackled with yet another emergency call. This one made her blood run cold. Mayday, mayday, this is Rescue 7. We're Jake Morrison and Ryan Parker, the crew you guided to the logging road. Earlier, we're safely on the ground, but we've discovered 3 other people here. Looks like they're injured climbers who were caught by the storm. They need immediate medical attention, but there's no way to get a rescue helicopter in here. With current weather conditions. Jake's voice was different now, stripped of its earlier arrogance and filled with genuine respect. Meridian maintenance, I don't know your name, but you saved our lives today. Now we need your help to save 3 more. Peggy felt the weight of every eye in the hangar as she reached for the radio microphone. The logging road where she'd guided Jake and Ryan was accessible by ground vehicles, but only if someone knew the correct access routes through miles of Forest Service roads. It would take hours for emergency services to find them using conventional methods. Time the injured climbers might not have, but Peggy knew every logging road, every Forest Service route, every way in and out of the wilderness areas surrounding Mount Hood. She'd spent decades flying over that terrain, memorizing landmarks and access points that could mean the difference between life and death in situations exactly like this. Jake, I'm going to coordinate with emergency services to get a ground rescue team to your location. First, I need you to describe exactly what you can see from the landing site. As Jake provided details about the terrain and the condition of the injured climbers, Peggy began coordinating with multiple agencies simultaneously. Forest Service rangers who knew the backcountry roads, search and rescue teams with medical equipment, and emergency medical technicians who could provide life-saving treatment once they reached the site. Dr. Martinez watched the coordination effort with professional fascination. You're doing the job of 6 different people, she observed. Most emergency coordinators specialize in one type of rescue. You're handling aircraft emergencies, medical situations, wilderness rescue, and interagency coordination all at the same time. That's what military training teaches you, Peggy replied while plotting routes on a topographic map. When you're the officer in charge of a combat search and rescue operation, you don't have the luxury of specialization. You use whatever knowledge and skills are necessary to bring people home alive. The truth was beginning to dawn on everyone in the hangar. They weren't watching an aging maintenance worker who'd been demoted for poor judgment. They were watching one of the most capable emergency coordinators in the region. Someone whose experience and knowledge had been dismissed and wasted because of bureaucratic prejudice and insurance liability concerns. Hendrik stood in the corner, his face pale as he listened to Peggy coordinate the rescue of the injured climbers. Every successful rescue, every life saved, was evidence of the catastrophic mistake he'd made 18 months earlier. The pilot he'd grounded for poor judgment was demonstrating judgment that exceeded anything he'd ever seen in his career. RADIO traffic continued its relentless pace, but Peggy handled each emergency with calm efficiency that came from decades of experience in life-or-death situations. As Storm Helena finally began to weaken, she had successfully coordinated the rescue of 19 people whose aircraft had been caught by the weather, plus the 3 injured climbers that Jake and Ryan had discovered. None of them would have survived. Without her knowledge, experience, and willingness to risk everything to save lives. The young pilots who dismissed her as too old and out of touch were learning that in aviation, experience wasn't just valuable, it was irreplaceable. By evening, Storm Helena had moved inland, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a region-wide aviation emergency that would be studied for years to come. The operations center at Meridian Air Rescue had been transformed into an impromptu command center, with representatives from the Federal Aviation Administration, National Transportation Safety Board, and multiple emergency services agencies. Coordinating the aftermath of the day's events, Peggy remained at her radio position, now officially coordinating search and rescue operations at the request of the FAA's Regional Emergency Coordinator. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. What had started as unauthorized radio transmissions to save Jake and Ryan had evolved into full-scale emergency management responsibilities that no one else in the facility was qualified to handle. Regional FAA Administrator Catherine Walsh arrived at 6:30 p.m., a woman in her 50s with 30 years of aviation experience and a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense to get results. She'd been monitoring the emergency frequencies from Portland, listening to Peggy coordinate rescue after rescue with a level of competence that had impressed every agency involved. "I need to speak with the person who's been handling air rescue." "Coordination," Walsh announced as she entered the hangar. "We've got 19 successful rescues today, 0 fatalities, and some of the most skilled emergency coordination I've ever witnessed. I want to know how one facility managed to outperform our entire regional emergency response network." Hendrik stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Administrator Walsh, I'm Chief Pilot Robert Hendricks. The person you're referring to is Margaret Chen, our maintenance inspector." Walsh's eyebrows rose sharply. "Maintenance inspector? Are you telling me that your maintenance staff has been coordinating multi-agency rescue operations?" "Ma'am, Mrs. Chen is a former military pilot with extensive experience in emergency situations. She took it upon herself to assist with today's emergencies, despite being instructed to remain off the radio frequencies." The careful phrasing wasn't lost on Walsh, who'd spent decades navigating aviation bureaucracy and could recognize corporate damage control when she heard it. "Let me speak with Mrs. Chen directly." Peggy looked up from the radio equipment, where she'd been coordinating the final stages of the climber rescue. The ground team had reached Jake and Ryan's position and was preparing to transport the injured climbers to a medical facility. Her voice was hoarse from hours of constant radio work, but her concentration remained sharp. Administrator Walsh, I'm Margaret Chen. I understand you have some questions about today's operations. Walsh studied Peggy with the kind of assessment that came from evaluating pilots and aviation professionals for 3 decades. What she saw was someone who moved with quiet confidence, whose technical knowledge was evident in every radio transmission, and whose calm professionalism had never wavered despite coordinating multiple life-or-death situations simultaneously. Mrs. Chen, I've been monitoring emergency frequencies all day. Your coordination of the Coast Guard rescue was textbook perfect. Your guidance of the medical helicopter to Sportsman's Air Park was brilliant improvisational flying. And your management of the multi-agency ground rescue operation would impress search and rescue coordinators with decades of experience. Walsh paused, her expression growing more serious. So I'm confused about why someone with your capabilities is working as a maintenance inspector. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the hangar knew the answer, but no one had been willing to say it out loud until now. Peggy's demotion hadn't been about competence or judgment. It had been about age discrimination, insurance liability, and a corporate culture that valued compliance over capability. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed the day's events firsthand. Administrator Walsh, Mrs. Chen was removed from flight status 18 months ago after conducting an unauthorized rescue mission that saved 3 lives. The official reason was poor judgment and failure to follow proper procedures. Unauthorized rescue mission? Walsh's tone sharpened. What kind of rescue mission? Peggy straightened slightly, preparing to defend actions she'd never regretted. 3 climbers were stranded on Mount Jefferson in deteriorating weather conditions. Company policy required waiting until morning and improved conditions before attempting rescue. I calculated that the climbers would die from hypothermia before morning, so I launched the mission despite being ordered to stand down. What was the outcome? All 3 climbers survived. The rescue was completed without incident, and we returned safely despite marginal weather conditions. Walsh turned to Hendricks, her expression growing cold. Chief Pilot Hendricks, are you telling me that you removed a pilot from flight status for successfully completing a life-saving rescue mission? Hendricks shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, Mrs. Chen violated direct orders and company weather minimums. The insurance carrier determined that her actions demonstrated age-related poor judgment and recommended her removal from flight duties. Age-related poor judgment. Walsh repeated the phrase slowly, her voice carrying dangerous undertones. And what was the insurance carrier's assessment based on? They cited studies showing that pilots over 55 tend to take unnecessary risks due to overconfidence and outdated flying techniques. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the hangar understood the implications of what Hendricks had just admitted. Peggy's removal from flight status hadn't been based on her actual performance or capabilities. It had been based on age discrimination disguised as risk management. Walsh's voice was ice cold when she spoke again. Chief Pilot Hendricks, I want you to understand something very clearly. Today, your maintenance inspector has demonstrated emergency coordination capabilities that exceed those of most regional emergency management centers. She has successfully guided aircraft to safety in conditions that grounded every other rescue operation in the Pacific Northwest. She has coordinated multi-agency responses that saved 22 lives. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Now you're telling me that this same person was demoted because an insurance company decided that her age made her a liability risk, despite having no evidence of actual poor performance? Jake Morrison's voice cut through the tension. He'd arrived at the hangar an hour earlier, transported by the same ground rescue team that had reached the injured climbers. His flight suit was torn and dirty, his face pale with exhaustion. but his eyes held a new understanding of what real flying experience meant. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Administrator Walsh, I need to say something. Jake's voice was different now, stripped of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier interactions. Mrs. Chen saved my life today. I ignored her warning about the weather, dismissed her concerns about the aircraft, and flew into conditions that nearly killed me and my co-pilot. When we got into trouble, she was the only person who knew how to get us out. He looked directly at Peggy, his expression filled with genuine remorse. I called her Granny and treated her like she was some old lady who didn't understand modern flying. But she knows more about aviation than I'll learn in 10 years. She knew exactly where we were, knew the location of every emergency landing site, and talked us through an approach that I couldn't have executed without her guidance. Ryan Parker, Jake's co-pilot, had been standing quietly in the background, but now he stepped forward. "Ma'am, I want to confirm everything Jake just said. Mrs. Chen didn't just save our lives. She saved them with knowledge and experience that you can't learn from textbooks or simulators. She knew the terrain, the weather patterns, the aircraft limitations, and the exact procedures needed to get us down safely." Walsh turned back to Hendricks. "Chief Pilot, I want to see Mrs. Chen's complete personnel file, including all documentation related to her removal from flight status. I also want to review the insurance carrier's assessment and any other materials related to this decision." "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's necessary. The decision was made 18 months ago, and Mrs. Chen has been performing adequately in her current position." "Adequately?" Walsh's voice rose slightly. "Chief Pilot, your adequate maintenance inspector has just demonstrated capabilities that would make her valuable to any emergency management organization in the country. She's coordinated more successful rescues in one day than most facilities handle in a year." Dr. Martinez stepped forward again, her voice carrying professional authority. "Administrator Walsh, I was present during the original incident that led to Mrs. Chen's demotion. As the flight surgeon, I supported her decision to attempt the rescue mission. The medical evidence was clear. The climbers would have died if we'd waited until morning." "And what was your assessment of her judgment and capabilities?" "Exceptional. Her risk assessment was mathematically sound. Her knowledge of aircraft performance was encyclopedic, and her execution was flawless. The only reason she was removed from flight status was insurance liability concerns, not actual performance issues." Walsh pulled out her tablet and began taking notes. "Mrs. Chen, I want to understand your background. What's your total flight experience?" 8,000 hours, ma'am. 28 years of military service, including combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've flown everything from training helicopters to heavy lift transport aircraft. I've been an instructor pilot, a check pilot, and a squadron operations officer." "And your civilian experience?" 18 months with Meridian Air Rescue, all of it in a maintenance capacity, except for the initial training period." Walsh shook her head in disbelief. "Chief Pilot Hendricks, you've had one of the most experienced emergency pilots in the region, working as a maintenance inspector for 18 months, while employing pilots with a fraction of her experience and knowledge?" The question was rhetorical, but the implications were clear. Meridian Air Rescue had wasted 18 months of exceptional talent because of age discrimination and bureaucratic cowardice. They'd grounded their most capable pilot and replaced her with young pilots who lacked the experience and judgment that today's emergencies had demanded. "Ma'am," Hendricks began, "the insurance requirements were very specific. Pilots over 55 were considered high risk, and the carrier threatened to cancel our coverage if we didn't comply with their recommendations." "What insurance carrier?" "Consolidated Aviation Insurance. They specialize in commercial aviation liability coverage." Walsh's expression darkened further. "Chief Pilot, Consolidated Aviation Insurance has been under federal investigation for age discrimination practices. They've been systematically pressuring aviation companies to remove older pilots regardless of their actual performance or capabilities. She closed her tablet and looked directly at Peggy. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Are you interested in returning to flight status?" Peggy felt something inside her chest that she hadn't experienced in 18 months. Hope. "Yes, ma'am, more than anything." "Good, because I'm going to recommend that the FAA conduct a full investigation into your removal from flight status. I'm also going to recommend that you be immediately reinstated as a pilot, with full authority to conduct emergency operations." She turned back to Hendricks. "Chief Pilot, you have 48 hours to restore Mrs. Chen to full flight status. If you refuse, I'll recommend that the FAA review your facility's operating certificate." The transformation was happening faster than anyone had expected. Peggy was no longer the maintenance inspector who'd been dismissed and ignored. She was becoming what she'd always been, one of the most skilled emergency pilots in the region. Someone whose experience and judgment had been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. But the real vindication was still to come. The FAA investigation began within hours of Administrator Walsh's ultimatum. By morning, investigators had arrived at Meridian Air Rescue with boxes of files and a mandate to examine every aspect of Peggy's demotion. What they discovered was a systematic pattern of age discrimination that extended far beyond her individual case. Senior investigator Daniel Kim had spent 15 years examining aviation safety violations, but the Consolidated Aviation Insurance files made him physically angry. The insurance company had developed what they called actuarial risk profiles that systematically targeted pilots over 55, regardless of their actual performance records. Their internal documents, obtained through federal subpoena, revealed a deliberate strategy to pressure aviation companies into removing older pilots by threatening coverage cancellation. "This isn't risk management," Kim told his team during the morning briefing. "This is systematic age discrimination disguised as actuarial science. They've destroyed dozens of careers based on statistical models that have no relationship to actual pilot performance." The investigation revealed that Peggy was one of 14 pilots across the region who'd been forced into early retirement or demoted based on Consolidated Aviation's recommendations. All of them had been over 55. All of them had exemplary safety records. And all of them had been replaced by younger pilots with significantly less experience. Dr. Rachel Torres, the aviation psychologist who testified against Peggy during her original hearing, found herself facing uncomfortable questions about her professional ethics. The FAA investigators had discovered that she'd been paid substantial consulting fees by Consolidated Aviation to provide psychological evaluations that supported their age discrimination agenda. Dr. Torres, investigator Kim asked during her deposition, "How many pilots over 55 have you evaluated for fitness of duty?" "I'd have to review my records to provide an exact number." "According to your billing records, you've evaluated 43 pilots over 55 in the past 3 years. How many of those evaluations concluded that the pilot was fit for continued duty?" Dr. Torres shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I evaluate each case individually based on professional standards and evidence-based assessment protocols." "That's not what I asked." "How many of those 43 evaluations concluded that the pilot was fit for duty?" "None of them." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. 43 evaluations, all of pilots over 55, and every single one had concluded that the pilot was unfit for duty. The statistical impossibility of such results was obvious to anyone with basic understanding of professional assessment protocols. "Dr. Torres, what's the probability that 43 randomly selected pilots would all be unfit for duty?" "I don't evaluate pilots randomly." I only evaluate those who are referred for fitness concerns. According to the case files, Mrs. Chen was referred for evaluation after successfully completing a rescue mission that saved 3 lives. What specific fitness concerns warranted psychological evaluation? Dr. Torres consulted her notes, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. Mrs. Chen demonstrated poor judgment by violating direct orders and company weather minimums. This suggested possible age-related deterioration in decision-making capacity. But the mission was successful. The climbers were rescued without incident. The aircraft returned safely. What evidence of deteriorated decision-making capacity did you observe? The decision to violate orders itself demonstrated impaired judgment. Investigator Kim leaned forward. Dr. Torres, are you testifying that following orders is more important than saving lives? I'm testifying that pilots who cannot follow established procedures pose a safety risk to themselves and others. The circular logic was becoming apparent to everyone in the room. Dr. Torres had concluded that Peggy was unfit for duty, not because of any actual safety violations or performance problems, but because she'd made a decision that saved lives while violating company policy. The age-related deterioration existed only in the insurance company's statistical models, not in any observable evidence of actual impairment. Meanwhile, the investigation into Peggy's actual performance painted a dramatically different picture. Flight instructors who'd worked with her during her initial civilian training described her as one of the most skilled pilots they'd ever encountered. Her simulator scores were perfect. Her written examinations exceeded the scores of pilots half. Her age, her emergency procedure knowledge was encyclopedic. Captain Maria Santos, a former military colleague who'd transitioned to civilian aviation 3 years earlier, provided testimony that demolished the insurance company's age discrimination arguments. I've known Peggy Chen for 15 years, she testified. I've flown with her in combat zones, trained with her in advanced emergency procedures, and watched her handle aircraft emergencies that would challenge pilots with any level of experience. Age has never been a factor in her performance. If anything, she's become more skilled and knowledgeable over time. The investigation also revealed that Jake Morrison and several other young pilots had been involved in incidents that would have grounded older pilots permanently. Jake's emergency landing during Storm Helena was actually his 3rd aircraft emergency in 18 months, including 2 instances where he'd violated weather minimums and endangered his crew. But his youth and adaptability had protected him from the kind of scrutiny that older pilots faced automatically. There's a clear double standard here, Investigator Kim noted in his preliminary report. Young pilots are given multiple chances to learn from mistakes, while older pilots are removed from duty for single incidents that actually demonstrate superior judgment and skill. The media attention began during the investigation's 2nd week. Local news stations picked up the story of the maintenance worker who'd coordinated 19 rescues during Storm Helena, discovering that she was actually an experienced military pilot who'd been demoted due to age discrimination. The story quickly gained national attention as an example of how bureaucratic liability management was wasting valuable talent and potentially costing lives. Reporter Jennifer Walsh of Channel 7 News interviewed several of the pilots Peggy had rescued during Storm Helena. Their testimonials were powerful and consistent. They would have died without her knowledge and experience. Jake Morrison's on-camera interview was particularly compelling. I was the guy who called her granny and treated her like she didn't know anything about flying, Jake said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. When my helicopter started falling apart in the middle of a storm, she was the only person who knew how to save us. She knew the terrain, the weather patterns, the aircraft limitations, and the exact procedures needed to get us down safely. I owe her my life. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Peggy received hundreds of letters from pilots. veterans, and aviation professionals expressing support and outrage about her treatment. Several major aviation companies contacted her directly, offering pilot positions with significantly better compensation and benefits than she'd ever received at Meridian Air Rescue. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. General Patricia Morrison, commander of the Air Force's Combat Search and Rescue Training Program, called Peggy personally to offer her a position as a senior instructor pilot. The conversation was brief but transformative. "Mrs. Chen," General Morrison said, "I've been following your situation through military channels. The Air Force is always looking for experienced pilots who can train the next generation of search and rescue specialists. Your performance during Storm Helena demonstrates exactly the kind of knowledge and judgment we need in our training programs." The offer was tempting, but Peggy had unfinished business at Meridian Air Rescue. She'd been proven right about everything: the weather conditions, the aircraft limitations, the risks of inexperienced pilots flying in dangerous conditions. But vindication wasn't enough. She wanted to ensure that no other pilot would face the kind of discrimination she'd endured. The investigation's preliminary findings were released on a Friday afternoon, and they were damning. Consolidated Aviation Insurance had systematically targeted older pilots based on age rather than performance. Dr. Torres had provided biased psychological evaluations that supported predetermined conclusions. Chief Pilot Hendricks had implemented discriminatory policies that violated federal employment laws. But the most significant finding was that Peggy's original rescue mission had been not only appropriate but exemplary. The FAA investigators concluded that her risk assessment had been mathematically sound, her execution flawless, and her decision to proceed despite orders absolutely justified by the circumstances. Mrs. Chen demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and skill that the aviation industry should value. The preliminary report stated her removal from flight status was based on age discrimination rather than any evidence of impaired performance. The rescue mission that led to her demotion actually provides evidence of superior pilot judgment and exceptional operational capability. Hendricks received a copy of the report on Friday evening. By Monday morning, he'd submitted his resignation and recommended that Peggy be promoted to chief pilot. The recommendation was approved by the company's board of directors within hours, along with a formal apology and a substantial financial settlement. Dr. Torres faced professional disciplinary action from the American Psychological Association and lost her consulting contracts with multiple aviation companies. Consolidated Aviation Insurance was fined $2.3 million for discriminatory practices and ordered to restore all pilots who'd been inappropriately removed from duty. But the most satisfying moment came during Peggy's first day back in the cockpit. As chief pilot, Jake Morrison approached her in the hangar, his expression serious and respectful. "Chief Chen," he said, using her new title with obvious sincerity, "I want to apologize for how I treated you. I was arrogant and stupid, and I almost got people killed because I was too proud to listen to someone with more experience." Peggy studied the young pilot, seeing genuine remorse and a new understanding of what experience meant in aviation. "Jake, we all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them. Are you ready to learn?" "Yes, ma'am. I want to be the kind of pilot who saves lives, not someone who needs saving." "Good, because I'm going to teach you everything I know about mountain flying, weather assessment, and emergency procedures. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be able to handle conditions that would challenge pilots with decades of experience." The transformation was complete. Peggy was no longer the maintenance inspector who'd been dismissed and ignored. She was the chief pilot, responsible for training the next generation of rescue pilots and ensuring that experience and judgment were valued over youth and technology. The young pilots who dismissed her as too old were now eager to learn from her. Insurance companies that had targeted her were facing federal scrutiny, And the aviation industry was beginning to understand that age discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was dangerous. Storm Helena had revealed the truth about experience versus inexperience, judgment versus technology, and the value of pilots who'd been tested by conditions that couldn't be simulated or taught in classrooms. Peggy had proven that in aviation, as in life, there was no substitute for knowledge earned through decades of real-world experience. The vindication was complete, but the real work was just beginning. 3 months after her promotion to chief pilot, Peggy stood in the flight briefing room addressing a group of new recruits who looked impossibly young but carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from rigorous training. The room itself had been transformed under her leadership, with detailed topographic maps covering every wall and weather monitoring equipment that provided real-time data on conditions throughout the Pacific Northwest. Weather kills more pilots than mechanical failures, enemy action, and human error combined, she told the assembled group. Technology can help you understand weather, but it cannot replace the judgment that comes from experiencing every type of condition this region can throw at you. Among the new recruits was Sarah Kim, a 24-year-old former Air Force pilot with impeccable credentials and an attitude that reminded Peggy of Jake Morrison during his early days. Sarah had graduated at the top of her military flight training class, accumulated over 800 hours in various aircraft, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly tested by circumstances beyond her control. "Chief Chen," Sarah asked, raising her hand with barely concealed impatience, "with modern weather radar and GPS navigation systems, isn't most of this local knowledge becoming obsolete? I mean, we can see weather patterns in real time and navigate precisely to any coordinates we need to reach." Peggy smiled, recognizing the question as both a challenge and a teaching opportunity. "Miss Kim, let me ask you something. Have you ever flown in conditions where your GPS showed you were flying through solid rock?" Sarah's confident expression faltered slightly. "Ma'am, that's not possible. GPS satellites provide accurate positioning within meters. Actually, it happens regularly in mountain terrain when satellite signals bounce off canyon walls and give false readings. I've seen pilots fly directly into mountainsides because they trusted GPS more than their own situational awareness." Peggy walked to the topographic map showing the Cascade Range. "Technology is a tool, not a replacement for judgment. When conditions deteriorate beyond the limits of your instruments, local knowledge and experience become the only thing standing between you and disaster." The training program Peggy had implemented was unlike anything the new recruits had experienced. Instead of focusing primarily on aircraft systems and emergency procedures, she emphasized understanding the environment where they would be operating. New pilots spent weeks learning about local weather patterns, studying topographic maps until they could navigate by landmarks alone, and practicing emergency procedures in actual mountain terrain rather than simulator environments. Jake Morrison, now promoted to senior pilot and serving as Peggy's deputy, had become one of her most effective instructors. His near-death experience during Storm Helena had transformed him from an arrogant, young pilot into someone who understood the value of experience and the importance of continuous learning. "The chief saved my life," Jake told the new recruits during his first training session. Not because she was lucky or because she had better equipment, but because she had knowledge that can't be downloaded or learned from textbooks. She knew the terrain, the weather patterns, and the aircraft limitations because she'd spent 30 years accumulating that knowledge through real-world experience. The cultural transformation at Meridian Air Rescue extended far beyond training programs. Peggy had implemented new policies that valued experience over youth, established mentorship programs that paired senior pilots with newer recruits, and created an environment where asking questions was encouraged rather than seen as weakness. Dr. Martinez, now serving as the facility's chief medical officer, had worked closely with Peggy to develop training programs that emphasized the medical aspects of search and rescue operations. Chief Chen understands that we're not just flying aircraft, she explained to the new recruits. We're providing emergency medical services in conditions that would challenge the most experienced healthcare providers. Every decision we make has to consider both aviation safety and patient care. The changes weren't limited to Meridian Air Rescue. Peggy's vindication had triggered a broader examination of age discrimination throughout the aviation industry. The FAA have launched investigations into insurance companies that systematically targeted older pilots, and several major aviation organizations had revised their policies to focus on performance rather than age. Admiral Rebecca Hayes, commander of the Coast Guard's Aviation Training Center, had invited Peggy to serve as a consultant on their advanced search and rescue programs. Mrs. Chen, Admiral Hayes had said during their initial meeting, your coordination of multiple rescues during Storm Helena demonstrated capabilities that we need to incorporate into our training programs. We want our pilots to have the same level of situational awareness and judgment that you demonstrated. The consulting work had brought Peggy into contact with military pilots who faced similar challenges to those she'd encountered in civilian aviation. Younger pilots, trained on advanced simulators and equipped with sophisticated technology, sometimes lacked the fundamental skills needed when equipment failed or conditions exceeded the parameters of their training. Simulation can teach you procedures, Peggy explained to a group of Coast Guard pilots during a training exercise, but it cannot teach you judgment. Judgment comes from experience, from having been in situations where everything goes wrong simultaneously, and you have to make decisions based on incomplete information and imperfect conditions. The demonstration that followed was typical of Peggy's teaching methods. She'd arranged for a simulated rescue scenario in actual mountain terrain, with real weather conditions and equipment failures that couldn't be anticipated or programmed. The younger pilots, despite their advanced training, struggled with the scenario until Peggy talked them through techniques that emphasized adaptability and situational awareness over technological solutions. This is what we call old school flying, she told them. It's not about ignoring technology. It's about understanding that technology can fail, and when it does, you need fundamental skills that can't be replaced by any computer system. Impact of Peggy's vindication extended beyond aviation into broader discussions about age discrimination in technical fields. She'd been invited to testify before congressional committees examining workplace discrimination, and her case had become a symbol of how bureaucratic liability management could waste valuable expertise and potentially cost lives. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, had called Peggy's case a perfect example of how insurance industry discrimination can undermine public safety. During her testimony, Peggy had explained how age discrimination in aviation wasn't just unfair to older pilots, it was dangerous for everyone. When you remove experienced pilots from service based on age rather than performance, she'd testified, you create a culture where youth and technology are valued over judgment and experience. This leads to situations where less experienced pilots are making life and death decisions in conditions that require knowledge that can only be gained through years of real-world experience. The legislative response had been swift and comprehensive. The Age Discrimination in Aviation Act, signed into law 6 months after Peggy's testimony, prohibited insurance companies from using age as a factor in pilot evaluations and established federal oversight of aviation industry employment practices. But the most significant changes were happening at the operational level, in facilities like Meridian Air Rescue, where Peggy was implementing training programs that emphasized experience-based learning over technology-dependent procedures. The new recruits were learning to fly in conditions that would have challenged their predecessors, but they were also learning to think like pilots rather than aircraft operators. Sarah Kim, The confident young pilot who'd questioned the relevance of local knowledge was beginning to understand the difference. During her first mountain rescue training flight, she'd encountered weather conditions that exceeded her GPS system's capabilities and found herself relying on Peggy's guidance to navigate safely through terrain that looked nothing like the simulator environments where she'd learned to fly. "Chief Chen," Sarah said after the training flight, her earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility, "I need to apologize. I thought my military training had prepared me for anything, but I've never experienced conditions like these." "How? Do you know exactly where you are when all your instruments are showing conflicting information?" Peggy smiled, remembering her own early experiences with mountain flying. "Ms. Kim, you know where you are because you've been there before. Every ridge, every valley, every weather pattern becomes familiar after you've flown through it dozens of times. Technology can help you, but it can't replace the knowledge that comes from experience." The training program that Sarah and the other new recruits were experiencing was based on Peggy's military experience but adapted for civilian search and rescue operations. It emphasized progressive skill development, starting with basic mountain flying techniques and advancing through increasingly complex scenarios that required decision-making under pressure. Ryan Parker, Jake's former co-pilot, had become one of the program's most successful graduates. His experience during Storm Helena had taught him to value guidance from more experienced pilots, and he'd developed into a skilled rescue pilot who understood the importance of continuous learning. "The chief taught me that being a good pilot isn't about knowing everything," Ryan explained to the new recruits. "It's about knowing what you don't know and being willing to learn from people who have more experience. Pride kills pilots, but humility keeps you alive." The success of Peggy's training programs had attracted attention from aviation organizations worldwide. Delegations from European and Asian search and rescue services had visited Meridian Air Rescue to observe her methods and adapt them for their own operations. The emphasis on experience-based learning and mentorship was being implemented in training programs across multiple countries. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Peggy's new position was the opportunity to mentor young pilots who reminded her of herself during her early military career. She saw in them the same eagerness to learn, the same dedication to saving lives, and the same potential for growth that had driven her own development as a pilot. "Flying is a career that rewards those who never stop learning," she told each new class of recruits. "The moment you think you know everything, you become dangerous to yourself and to the people depending on you. Experience is valuable not because it makes you infallible, but because it teaches you to recognize your limitations and work within them." The transformation at Meridian Air Rescue had been so complete that the facility was now considered a model for search and rescue operations throughout the region. Other aviation companies were sending their pilots for training, and the FAA had designated the facility as a center of excellence for mountain rescue operations. But Peggy's greatest achievement wasn't the awards or recognition she'd received. It was the knowledge that the discrimination she'd faced had been transformed into positive change that would benefit future generations of pilots. The young pilots who dismissed her as too old were now eager to learn from her experience, and the aviation industry was beginning to understand that age discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was operationally dangerous. As she watched the new recruits practice emergency procedures with the kind of precision that came from understanding rather than memorization, Peggy felt a satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. She was ensuring that the next generation of rescue pilots would be better prepared than their predecessors, equipped not just with modern technology, but with the judgment and experience needed to use that technology effectively. The lessons learned during Storm Helena had become the foundation for a new approach to aviation training that emphasized the irreplaceable value of experience while embracing technological advancement. It was a legacy that would save lives for years to come, and it had emerged from the determination of one pilot who refused to accept that her age made her less valuable than her experience proved her to be. 1 year after Storm Helena, Peggy stood in the operations center watching a weather system that reminded her uncomfortably of the day that had changed everything. Winter Storm Marcus was tracking toward the Pacific Northwest, with winds approaching 140 miles per hour and the potential for unprecedented ice accumulation. The National Weather Service had issued warnings not seen in decades, and aviation authorities were preparing for what could be the most challenging weather emergency in regional history. Not the difference this time was preparation. Instead of a handful of inexperienced pilots flying aircraft they didn't fully understand, Peggy commanded a team of thoroughly trained rescue specialists who'd spent months learning to operate in conditions that would have grounded their predecessors. The facility's weather monitoring capabilities had been upgraded, communication systems improved, and emergency protocols revised based on lessons learned from the previous year's disasters. "Chief, we're getting reports of a research team stranded at the Mount Baker Observatory," reported Lieutenant Commander Lisa Chen. No relation to Peggy, but a former Navy pilot who joined Meridian Air Rescue specifically to work under her leadership. 6 people, including 2 with medical conditions that require daily medication. They've got enough supplies for maybe 3 days, but this storm is forecast to last at least a week. Peggy studied the weather data streaming across multiple monitors. Mount Baker Observatory sat at 7,200 feet elevation, accessible only by helicopter. During the best conditions, the approaching storm would create wind speeds and turbulence that exceeded the operational limits of most aircraft, and the ice accumulation would make landing nearly impossible even if they could reach the location. "What's the timeline on the storm's arrival?" she asked. "Weather Service is calling for deteriorating conditions starting in 4 hours, with the worst of it hitting around midnight," Lisa replied. "After that, we're looking at sustained winds over 120 miles per hour, with severe icing conditions that could last for days, 4 hours. Peggy ran the calculations in her mind, considering aircraft performance, fuel consumption, and the tactical challenges of landing at high altitude in deteriorating weather. It would be possible, but it would require the kind of precision flying and risk assessment that could only come from extensive experience and training. "Jake, what's our aircraft status?" she called to her deputy, who was coordinating with the maintenance team. "We've got 3 birds available," Jake reported. "The 429 is configured for high-altitude operations, the 412 is set up for medical transport, and the 407 is ready for reconnaissance if we need it." 3 aircraft, each with specific capabilities that would be crucial for a successful rescue. Operation. The Bell 429 could handle the altitude and weather conditions at Mount Baker, but its passenger capacity was limited. The 412 could carry more people, but would struggle with the high-altitude performance required. The 407 was fast and maneuverable, but lacked the power for high-altitude operations in severe weather. "Sarah, what's your assessment of the approach to Mount Baker in these conditions?" Peggy asked the young pilot who'd questioned the value of local knowledge during her early training. Sarah Kim had transformed dramatically during her year of training under Peggy's mentorship. The confident young pilot who'd believed technology could replace experience had become a skilled mountain rescue specialist who understood the importance of weather assessment and tactical planning. "Chief, the standard approach from the west will be impossible due to wind shear and turbulence created by the terrain," Sarah reported, consulting detailed topographic maps and weather data. "But there's a possibility of approaching from the southeast, using the ridgeline to provide wind protection during the final approach." The southeastern approach was a technique that Peggy had developed during her military service, using terrain features to create pockets of relatively calm air during high wind conditions. It required intimate knowledge of local geography and wind patterns. The kind of information that couldn't be programmed into GPS systems or learned from textbooks. Excellent. Analysis, Peggy acknowledged. Ryan, what's your fuel calculation for a high-altitude rescue with multiple passengers? Ryan Parker had become one of the facility's most skilled flight planners, his near-death experience during Storm Helena having taught him to respect the importance of precise calculations and contingency planning. Chief, we're looking at approximately 2 hours of flight time round trip, plus 30 minutes for the rescue operation. With current fuel loads and high-altitude performance degradation, we'll need to plan for at least 3 hours of fuel consumption. The mathematics were challenging but manageable. The Bell 429 could carry enough fuel for the mission while maintaining adequate reserve for unexpected complications. But the operation would require split-second timing and perfect execution, with no margin for error or equipment failures. Dr. Martinez, what's the medical assessment of the stranded personnel? Peggy asked the facility's chief medical officer. 2 of the researchers required daily medication for serious cardiac conditions, Dr. Martinez reported. Without their medication, they'll experience life-threatening complications within 72 hours. The others are healthy but not equipped for extended survival in extreme weather conditions. 72 hours. The storm was forecast to last at least a week, which meant the rescue had to be completed before conditions deteriorated beyond the limits of safe helicopter operations. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to wait for improved weather. Chief. Chen, came a voice from the radio communication center. We've got the National Weather Service on the line. They want to discuss the rescue timeline. Peggy walked to the communications console where Dr. Robert Stevens, the regional weather service director, was waiting to provide updated forecasts. She'd worked with Dr. Stevens during several previous emergency operations, and his assessments had always been accurate and realistic. Peggy, I've got to be honest with you, Dr. Stevens said, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering difficult news. This storm is going to be worse than anything we've seen in decades. Winds will exceed 140 miles per hour, ice accumulation will be severe, and visibility will drop to 0. If you're going to attempt this rescue, you need to launch within the next 3 hours. 3 hours. The timeline had just accelerated, requiring immediate preparation and launch procedures. But Peggy had trained her team for exactly this kind of scenario, where successful operations depended on rapid decision-making and flawless execution under pressure. Dr. Stevens, what's the confidence level on your 3-hour window? She asked. Very high. Our computer models are showing remarkable consistency, and the satellite imagery confirms the storm's track and intensity. After 5 p.m., conditions will deteriorate rapidly and remain dangerous for at least 5 days. Peggy turned to her team, seeing the same focused determination that had carried them through dozens of successful rescue operations. They understood the stakes, the risks, and the narrow window of opportunity that would determine whether 6 people lived or died. We're launching in 1 hour, she announced. Sarah, you'll pilot the 429 with Ryan as co-pilot. Jake, you'll coordinate ground operations and maintain radio contact throughout the mission. Dr. Martinez, you'll accompany the flight to provide medical assessment once we reach the observatory. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation activities that had become second nature through months of training and real-world operations. Pre-flight inspections were completed with meticulous attention to detail. Weather data was analyzed and reanalyzed, and emergency procedures were reviewed for every possible scenario. At 4:15 p.m., the Bell 429 lifted off from Meridian Air Rescue's helipad, climbing rapidly toward Mount Baker through increasingly turbulent air. Peggy occupied the left seat as pilot in command, with Sarah serving as co-pilot to gain experience in extreme weather operations. The aircraft performed beautifully, its advanced systems providing the precision control needed for high-altitude flying in challenging conditions. "Chief, we're encountering moderate turbulence at 5,000 feet, Sarah reported, her voice calm despite the aircraft's movement. "Should we climb to find smoother air?" "Negative," Peggy replied, studying the weather radar display. "The turbulence will get worse at higher altitudes due to wind shear. We'll stay at this altitude until we reach the key approach corridor." The flight to Mount Baker took 47 minutes, threading through mountain passes that were already showing signs of the approaching storm. Visibility was decreasing rapidly, and the aircraft's ice detection systems were beginning to show the first signs of accumulation on the rotor blades. "Observatory in sight," Sarah announced as they crested the final ridge. "Landing area looks clear, but I can see ice forming on the ground." The Mount Baker Observatory was a collection of research buildings perched on a narrow plateau surrounded by steep terrain. The designated landing area was a concrete pad barely larger than the helicopter's rotor disc, with no room for error. "During the approach or departure?" "Beginning approach," Peggy announced, taking control of the aircraft for the most challenging phase of the operation. The southeastern approach she'd planned required threading between two mountain peaks, while compensating for wind that was gusting to nearly 80 miles per hour. The landing was a masterpiece of precision flying, setting the aircraft down on the concrete pad, with movements so subtle that the passengers barely felt the touchdown. Within minutes, Dr. Martinez was evaluating the stranded researchers, while the flight crew prepared for immediate departure. "We've got a problem," Dr. Martinez reported over the intercom. "One of the cardiac patients is showing signs of early heart failure. He needs immediate medical attention, but we're at maximum passenger capacity." Maximum passenger capacity. The Bell 429 could carry 6 passengers under normal conditions, but the high altitude and severe weather were reducing its performance significantly. Adding a 7th passenger would put the aircraft beyond its operational limits, potentially causing catastrophic failure during the departure. "Chief, I've got an idea," Sarah said, her voice carrying the confident problem-solving attitude that Peggy had worked to develop in her pilots. "What if we redistribute the weight? Put the medical patient in the front seat and have Dr. Martinez monitor him during the flight?" The suggestion demonstrated exactly the kind of creative thinking that separated exceptional pilots from those who simply followed procedures. By moving the most critical patient to the front of the aircraft and having the medical officer provide continuous monitoring, they could safely transport all 6 researchers while maintaining aircraft performance within acceptable limits. "Excellent thinking," Peggy acknowledged. "Let's implement it immediately." The departure from Mount Baker was even more challenging than the approach, requiring precise power management and flight control inputs to coax the heavily loaded aircraft off the ground in increasingly severe weather conditions. But the months of training and real-world experience had prepared the crew for exactly this kind of situation. As they descended toward lower altitudes and warmer air, the ice began shedding from the aircraft surfaces, and the flight controls became more responsive. The cardiac patient remained stable under Dr. Martinez's care, and the other researchers were experiencing nothing more serious than anxiety and mild altitude sickness. "Meridian Base, this is Rescue 1, Peggy transmitted as they approached the facility. 6 souls on board, 1 medical priority, mission accomplished." The response came from Jake, his voice carrying relief and pride. "Copy Rescue 1, outstanding work. Medical team is standing by for immediate transport to Regional Medical Center." As the helicopter settled onto the landing pad, Peggy felt the same satisfaction she'd experienced during her military career when complex operations concluded successfully. But this satisfaction was different, deeper, because it represented not just personal achievement but the successive training programs and operational changes that had transformed aviation safety throughout the region. The rescued Researchers were transferred to medical care within minutes, and the cardiac patient was stabilized and transported to a cardiac care unit where his condition was successfully managed. All 6 people survived what could have been a fatal situation, saved by the combination of skilled flying, precise planning, and the kind of experience-based training that Peggy had implemented. Winter Storm Marcus struck the Pacific Northwest with unprecedented fury, grounding all aircraft for 6 days and creating conditions that would have made the rescue impossible if they'd delayed even an hour. The success of the Mount Baker operation became a case study in emergency management and aviation safety, demonstrating how proper training and experience could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. But for Peggy, the real victory was watching Sarah Kim and Ryan Parker perform with the competence and judgment that came from understanding rather than memorization. They'd learned to think like pilots, to assess situations based on experience and knowledge rather than simply following procedures. The transformation was complete, and the next generation of rescue pilots was ready to carry on the tradition of excellence that had saved so many lives. 5 years later, Peggy stood before the newly constructed Aviation Excellence Center, watching the bronze plaque being unveiled that would bear her name. The Margaret Chen Center for Emergency Aviation Training had become the premier facility in North America for training rescue pilots. With a waiting list of candidates from around the world, the ceremony was attended by dozens of pilots whose lives she'd saved, either directly through rescue operations or indirectly through the training program she'd developed. Jake Morrison, now a chief pilot himself at another facility, served as the keynote speaker. Chief Chen taught us that experience isn't just about time in the cockpit, Jake told the assembled crowd. It's about wisdom earned through facing the impossible and finding a way to succeed anyway. She showed us that being underestimated isn't a disadvantage, it's an opportunity to prove everyone wrong. Sarah Kim, now an instructor pilot at the center, approached Peggy after the ceremony. "Chief, I wanted to thank you for teaching me that confidence without competence is dangerous, but competence with humility is unstoppable." Peggy smiled, watching a new class of young pilots practice emergency procedures with the same precision she'd once demanded from herself. "Sarah, the best compliment you can give me is to pass that knowledge on to the next generation. Make sure they understand that in aviation, there's no substitute for experience combined with the courage to use it." As the sun set over the Pacific Northwest mountains, Peggy reflected on the journey that had brought her from a dismissed maintenance worker to one of the most respected figures in aviation. She'd proven that age was just a number, that experience was irreplaceable, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly who you need when everything goes wrong. What did you think of Peggy's incredible journey from dismissed maintenance worker to aviation legend? Her story proves that experience and determination can overcome any obstacle, and that those who underestimate us often provide the greatest motivation to succeed. If you enjoyed this inspiring story of perseverance, courage, and ultimate vindication, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community of viewers who believe in the power of never giving up. We share amazing true stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Just like Peggy Chen. What's your favorite part of Peggy's story? Drop a comment below and let us know. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest inspirational content. Until next time, remember, your experience and wisdom are your greatest assets, no matter what anyone else might say.